Good morning, good afternoon, or good evening, depending on where you are right now. Thanks for tuning in, and I hope you enjoy what will be a brief overview of how the Japan Times has covered cultural issues. What I'll be attempting today is akin to skipping a small stone across a large lake, bouncing along quickly, touching only a few points on the surface of a vast, deep body of history. But in the process, I hope to give you a small taste of the kinds of cultural stories that have been important to our paper over the years. To begin with, when the Japan Times was founded in 1897, the editorial emphasis was on politics and economics, not culture of any sort. Since the arrival of Commodore Perry in 1853, Western visitors to Japan had written countless books and articles on Buddhism and Shinto, Japanese lacquerware, sword making, ukiyo-e prints, kabuki, no, kyogen, and rakugo, as well as sumo and the floating world of the geisha. Thanks to the 1867 Paris Exposition, the 1872 Kyoto Exposition, the first time in history group tours of Westerners visited Japan's ancient cultural capital, and the 1873 Vienna World's Fair, Japan's traditional arts were all the rage in Europe and the United States. In fact, so famous was Japan for its artistic culture that Oscar Wilde satirized Western writers who portrayed Japan as less a real country and more a work of artistic imagination. Wilde declared the whole of Japan is pure invention. Rudyard Kipling visited Japan in the late 1800s and remarked how he was in the country that was praised as a nation of artists. In other words, Japanese traditional art and culture was not new to most Westerners in 1897. Still exotic, perhaps, but not new. Thus, the Japan Times editors did not feel a need in the very beginning to publish what are now called culture and lifestyle sections. Japanese literature, however, was mentioned in the March 22nd, 1897 inaugural edition. To understand a people properly, the first essential is a thorough mastery of its language and an intimate acquaintance with its literature. There was no mention of the visual and performing arts, but there were reviews of two Japanese books. The first was a history of Sapporo, written by the Sapporo Historical Society. Sapporo was then 25 years old, and the authors predicted that by 1947 it would be to Japan what Edinburgh was to Great Britain. The other book introduced was one on the swamps, lakes, and rivers of Japan. 5 days later, on March 27th, 1897, we see the first ever mention of Kabuki in the paper, a performance at the Kabuki Zoo in Tokyo. The play, Satsumodori, the paper says, promises to be of interest to foreign visitors as they will be afforded an opportunity to see something of Japanese dancing. The first mention of geisha in the Japan Times occurred on May 14th, 1897. In a somewhat disparaging tone of voice, the newspaper, reporting on woven goods in Kyoto's Nishinjin district, notes that the industry depends on the patronage of geisha and abandoned women, and that some geisha might order obi for the kimonos that cost 200 yen, a huge amount in 1897 and far above what most people could pay. In the early years, it seems that the Japan Times editors assumed readers had some prior familiarity with Japanese culture, as the few articles on it contain no background explanation. This would later change, possibly because of a desire to draw more foreign readers unfamiliar with Japan, possibly because of a desire to not only report Japan, but also introduce Japanese culture from a Japanese perspective. For example, on February 5th, 1914, there's an article about Setsubun that goes into detail about what it is, gives the English translations for Oniwasoto and Uchi, and mentions some of the temples and shrines in the Tokyo area it takes place at. And from the beginning, the Japan Times was Tokyo-centric in its view of Japan. It would only be much later, indeed until long after the Second World War, that the paper would cover more aspects of Japanese regional culture. But in the years before and after the First World War, Tokyo was culturally an exciting place to be and the center of the country. The Taisho era, with its mix of Western and Japanese architectural and fashion styles, and the so called liberal Taisho democracy period, had its own cultural style. During this time, the Japan Times expanded its coverage into gastronomical culture. The first mention of sashimi in the paper comes from an April 17th, 1912 article. It mentions sashimi was served during a dinner given the previous month by the Japan Society in New York. The dinner was for someone named Viscount Chinda, and guests included the leading Japanese residents of New York. But readers were probably less interested in the fact sashimi had been served in New York, of all places, and more concerned about another piece of news that appeared on the front pages that very same day. The Titanic struck an iceberg and sank near Newfoundland. Of course, food culture would play a major role in the Japan Times after that first mention of sashimi. Here's a restaurant guide published on February 19th, 1930, Dining Places for Fastidious People. It introduces a dozen of Tokyo's top Japanese and Western restaurants and cafes. Several, including the Tokyo Kaikon, are still around, while the current Chez Mortier restaurant is the descendant of Chuote. So by the time the Taisho period ended in 1926 and the Showa era began, the Japan Times was still focused on domestic and regional political, military, and business news stories. But it was slowly starting to add more articles on Japanese culture and, for lack of a better phrase, the Western cultural scene in Tokyo. A pivotal moment in how the Japan Times covered the cultural scene came in December 1928, not with a daily edition of the paper, but rather with a 300-page book published to commemorate the enthronement of Emperor Hirohito, known, of course, posthumously as the Showa Emperor. What's significant is that in addition to congratulatory messages from the world's prominent men, there are short, detailed essays on all aspects of Japanese society, including Japanese culture. It was the first time that the Japan Times made this kind of effort to introduce Japanese culture in one publication as opposed to merely report it piecemeal in the daily news pages. For example, there were essays entitled History of Religions in Japan, Artistic Japan, and even Evolution of Women's Culture, which was written by a man, as well as reports on the feminine movements in Japan and the achievements of women scholars, including one essay by a woman. The book also included essays on traditional Japanese festivals and brief histories of Kyoto and Nara. None of the information was new, but the fact it was included showed readers' tastes and views of Japan, and what they wanted from the Japan Times was changing. The editorial focus was still concentrated on hard news, but slowly, cultural news became a regular part of the coverage. Here are a few select examples. By April 1st, 1930, a sports page had been added in recognition that Western sports like baseball were popular, while Tokyo's interest in hosting an Olympics was also growing. It would, in fact, win the 1940 Olympics, only to see it canceled due to the war. On the literary scene, Lafcadio Hearn, then as now perhaps the most famous or infamous Western writer on Japan, is the subject of a report, no doubt in recognition of Hearn's continued influence on Western perceptions of Japan, even though he had died back in 1904. The paper also began running a column called Notes on Art and Literature, which mentioned the comings and goings of notable cultural figures. Previously, this kind of gossip had been reserved for the comings and goings of diplomats, statesmen, captains of industry, and royalty. And I found it interesting that the Japanese artists mentioned in this edition include an ukiyo-e artist as well as two others who had studied in Paris. Ukiyo-e and Paris are, of course, forever linked with the 19th century Japonism movement in Europe, which continued to play a prominent role in not only how the West saw Japanese art, but also, it seems, how Japanese artists saw themselves. The first Japanese film theater was the Denkikan in Tokyo's Asakusa district, which began showing silent films in 1903. By 1909, the Japan Times was running short three-line announcements about cinematograph entertainment at the Denkikan and elsewhere. In 1929, the Japan Advertiser, which would later merge with the Japan Times and is also available in our archives now, ran a column called Screen Music Stage. It focused on film, musical reviews, and plays. On January 11th, 1929, it's announced that Tempest, starring John Barrymore and German actress Camelia Horn, will be playing in Tokyo, and that Barrymore himself will visit Tokyo. By 1936, talkie films were all the rage, and there were more lengthy film summaries and reviews of Western and Japanese films. Here we see stills from The Unguarded Hour with Francois Tone and Loretta Young, as well as the comedy Earthworm Tractor, starring Joey Brown and June David. Other films reviewed include The Last of the Mohicans with Randolph Scott, a Japanese film, Ashita no Namikiji with Sachiko Chiba and Heihachiro Okawa is also profiled. As the 1930s progressed, other subjects deemed cultural began to get ink in the paper. The March 1st, 1937 column, The Women's Sphere, is a kind of proto fashion column with advice on what to wear. But by then, Japan and the world were slowly marching towards World War. Government censors were cracking down on what could and could not be published. While hard news was curbed, certain aspects of traditional Japanese culture and history became propaganda tools if they were seen as helping promote the government's aims. During the Second World War, under heavy censorship, the Japan Times wrote about different aspects of traditional culture in ways it had not done previously. Yet, even cultural stories deemed innocent and non political by the standards of the readers and editors of the time could get censored for reasons that were often inconsistent. Two examples that did make it to print are those on Buddhism and a July 5th, 1942 article on the Tanabata Festival. Interesting to note that the July 5th page reporting the Tanabata Festival also contains a piece on German Buddhist scholar Bruno Petzold. He'd been a journalist in China before the war and became an expert on Japan's Tendai sect of Buddhism. As a German national and ally of Japan, he had freedom of movement in the country, others did not. In the mid to late 20th century, the serialization of novels was a regular feature in many newspapers. During the war years, when government approved news often came in sparingly, the Japan Times filled out its 8 daily pages with occasional serializations, such as The Vendetta of Akko, the story of the revenge of the 47 Ronin. Post war, this classic story would become one of the most well known Japanese folk tales internationally. During the war, it was a not so subtle call on the part of the government, via the paper, for Japanese people to endure and sacrifice. Specialization began on Wednesday, June 10th, 1942, 3 days after the Battle of Midway, the turning point in the Pacific War. By the time the August 15th, 1945 edition announced the emperor had issued an imperial rescript ending the war, the paper had shrunk to just 2 pages. Yet, even on this historic day, there was a small cultural news item, no doubt reflecting what was on the minds of the writer and the editors who ran it. On page 2, there's mention of the Daihikaku, described as a simple pavilion on the outskirts of Kyoto's Arashiyama district. The article notes the English translation of Daihikaku is pavilion of great sorrow or pavilion of great mercy. After the war years, during which traditional culture was used by the media to rouse a nation to war, this article is telling readers that peace, sorrow, and mercy are also firmly rooted in Japan's traditional culture. As the post war era at the Japan Times would show, introducing and reporting all aspects of traditional and modern culture would become a core mission for the paper's owners and editors. But in the immediate post war period, American occupations monitored the traditional arts carefully, censoring things they saw as detrimental to their mission of building a new democratic nation. They also took to the pages of the Japan Times to explain traditional culture themselves. In the July 20th, 1946 edition, we see an article on Kabuki by Major Fabian Bowers. An academic and Japanese theater expert, Bowers served as occupation head General Douglas MacArthur's interpreter. He begins by describing Kabuki as a style of drama identifiable by its hyperbolic acting and 3 kinds of music. And he says that in its coldest aspect, it's a kind of dance, while in its warmest, Kabuki is the actor's humanity bursting through traditional stylization. Articles introducing various forms of traditional culture, both the profound and the mundane, would follow. In the January 16th, 1953 edition, we see a preview of a Japanese fine art display at the Tokyo National Museum. Beside it is a small article on the Japanese sake cup. This kind of simple explanation of ordinary Japanese cultural items had been of little interest to pre-war editors. As the 1960s arrived, Western music was growing in popularity. The Japan Times article of August 15th, 1960 noted Tokyo was now the world's musical melting pot, where orchestral, jazz, and even Hawaiian music were embraced, and where piano lessons for the kids and a record player in the home were status symbols of the growing middle classes. The article added that long hairs of the period spent their time at record concerts, coffee shops with superb concert hall sized sound systems where you listen to a record in silence while enjoying a cup of coffee. I'm pleased to report that there are still a few record coffee shops around today. I know of one in Kyoto and one in Otaru, and I'm sure that there are many others. 1964 was a key year in the Japan Times coverage of culture. The opening of the Tokyo to Osaka bullet train right before the Tokyo Olympics meant Kyoto was just 3 hours and 36 minutes from Tokyo Station. By this time, the paper was bringing in more foreign residents to write cultural columns, and Personally Oriented by Jay and Sumi Gluck was one. Here on October 5th, 1964, days before the opening ceremony, they offer a brief introduction to Kyoto designed for those who came for the Olympics but wanted a quick side trip to Kyoto before returning home. On that same page, the articles ran a column aimed at Tokyo residents. It was called Tokyo After Dark, penned by an anonymous correspondent known only as Night Owl. For fans of Western night culture in Japan, especially music, the place to be in 1964 was the New Latin Quarter nightclub, where crooner Bobby Rydell, hey, we all remember him, right? Is compared to Frank Sinatra. One of the most famous post war columnists was Donald Ritchie. His October 2nd, 1971 story about the discovery of a lost film by director Tenosuke Kinugasa, called A Page of Madness in English, eventually led to his famed Asian bookshelf column, which introduced generations of readers around the world to Japanese literature. And there are too many columnists who wrote about culture in the last decades of the 20th century to list here, so I'll mention just two in passing. Karen Hill Anton's Crossing Cultures showed us what life was like as a foreigner in a small Shizuoka prefectural village. Her writing was warm, witty, thoughtful, and deeply moving. It inspired younger readers to seek out their own Japan rather than rely on the one portrayed in textbooks, Hollywood films, or even in the English language media. And at the end of the 1990s, Robert Yellen wrote a series of articles on Japan's ceramic scene. His expertise and passion for Japanese ceramics was obvious and helped raise the profile of and respect for Japanese ceramics abroad. Among those who would go on to visit his gallery would be Apple founder Steve Jobs. The first decades of the 21st century saw Japanese popular culture in the pages of the Japan Times like never before. On July 11th, 1990, there was a report that Tokyo's National Museum of Art was holding an exhibition of cartoonist Osamu Tezuka, he of Astro Boy fame, although the headline writers used the word manga. This marked the first time ever the museum held a one man exhibition of a manga artist. That same day's paper provided readers with a nice graph explaining the history of modern Japanese cartoonography, dating back to the 1930s, with titles like Fukuchan and Norakuro. Over 3 decades later, Japan's mask, manga, anime, sushi, karaoke culture is established worldwide and in the pages of the Japan Times, as seen here in a July 2014 piece about Sailor Moon. Although in place of karaoke, the paper was now running lots of pieces about live musicians, such as famed composer Ryuichi Sakamoto, interviewed for the April 1st, 2016 edition. Today, mass culture continues to remain important to the Japan Times. So does one form mentioned in passing back in 1897, Japanese literature. In the December 1st, 2022 edition, we ran a story about a new magazine called Monkey that promotes English translations of Japanese literature. On December 31st, we ran a story about the rising international fame of Japanese female authors, who had come a long way indeed from the lone female essayist whom the editors published 94 years previously in the 1928 Coronation book. So this brings us to the present, which is difficult for me to talk about because my beat is not the cultural beat. I approach today's presentation as a news reporter, digging through the archives for interesting tidbits to tell a chronological history. As a reader, though, I can say the Japan Times remains very focused on culture. As a reporter, I think that's a far more difficult task than in the past. This is because what is viewed as culture expands with successive generations. This makes a clear delineation between a cultural story and a non cultural story much more difficult. But that's always an interesting challenge for the Japan Times editors and readers and reporters. So, as I said at the beginning, I've done nothing more today than skip a stone across a large, deep lake that is the history of the Japan Times cultural coverage. In conclusion, I encourage all of you as well to skip across, splash about in, or take a dive, shallow or deep, into this history, regardless of your individual tastes and regardless of what you see as culture. It's one of the most enjoyable and educational forms of swimming that I know of, and once into the archives, you may find it difficult to come up for air. Thank you for listening.